is look at how we bring effective use of teacher aids, universally designed assessment, an inclusive curriculum, knowing our students' strengths and functional impacts, and the UDL framework together. So we'll have a look at how we do that now. And then we're going to give you a go at it. Remember, this is a webinar, so we'll try to make this as practical as possible, but it's not always possible. So coming back to the definition of universal design. If you remember back to our first webinar, the first process of developing an inclusive curriculum around the Australian curriculum is going to the content descriptors and deconstructing them. What is the essential knowledge that the content descriptors are requiring me to teach? And what is the essential skills the content descriptors are requiring me to model? We can look at the content descriptors, we can look at the elaborations, we can look at the examples on the ACARA website. But for us to develop an inclusive curriculum, we need to ensure that we're teaching the essential knowledge and modeling the essential skills. We then need to look at the achievement standards, and we need to work out what is it that students essentially need to demonstrate against the achievement standards and what don't they need to demonstrate. We watched that video from the Queensland Department of Education with Jeff Suter that defined what writing is in the English curriculum and what it is in the achievement standard, and that idea that after year 3, students don't have to demonstrate handwriting to demonstrate the achievement standards. Coming back to what the achievement standard is asking by defining those cognitive verbs and any important glossary terms. Then we think about when we look at the gradual release of responsibility, because we know direct instruction or explicit instruction is an effective way of teaching. There are 4 stages to it. We contextualize the learning. So we take that essential knowledge from the content descriptor and we contextualize that learning for our student. Then the teacher models the skills in the content descriptor. So they do that individually for the students by themselves, talking out their cognitive thoughts so that students can, what they see the teacher does responds to how the teacher's talking out their cognitive thoughts. Then the teacher does it collaboratively with their students. Then the students move into group work and individual work. And during this group work and individual work, the students are working towards the achievement standards. If you're working towards the content descriptors, or the students are working towards the content descriptors, you're wasting your time. Remember, the Australian curriculum is designed that the content descriptors is what the teacher teaches and models, and the achievement standards are what the students demonstrate. So if we have a look at this, and we're talking about causes of World War I, we might be looking at some videos of the causes of World War I, looking at some cartoons, talking about it, reading, developing some flowcharts, mind maps, Venn diagrams, those sort of things. Then looking at some sources about World War I. So the teacher might read one aloud, talking out their thoughts, deconstructing that source, working out information about the causes of World War I from that. So the teacher models it individually. Then the next step is the teacher has a look at another one and then pretends to be play dumb and say, oh, I forget what to do here. Who in the class can remind me, what's the first step I do? So including those students in that modeling with the teacher. Then the students move into individually, deconstructing sources about the causes of World War I, doing that in groups, and then individually. And remembering that when we looked at the effective use of teacher aids, when students are working in groups, the teacher and teacher aid are moving around to different groups. Same with individually, when students are working individually, if the teacher aid sees a student struggling, going over to talk to the teacher. If we, some people prefer a table way of looking at things. So when we talk about the curriculum that we deconstructed, in that contextualization stage, you're contextualizing the essential knowledge from the content descriptor. Then you're modeling the essential skills. During group and individual work, the students are demonstrating against the achievement standards. So then we start to think about what those strategies that we identified for our students. So if you remember back to the second webinar, we looked at the essential characteristics of the students that we see in our class. What are their strengths? What are their functional impacts? And we identified strategies that we use would be effective in relation to their strengths and functional impacts. Now, as we put these into the gradual release and responsibility, again, we're thinking about that UDL framework, remembering that in the UDL framework, principle one is that idea that I engage kids in the learning process in multiple ways. So that principle one around engagement applies during that whole lesson sequence. Principle two is when I represent and teach and model the essential knowledge from the content descriptors and essential skills, I'm thinking about principle two. So when I'm contextualizing that essential knowledge from the content descriptors, I'm thinking about principle two. And when I'm modeling it individually and with the class, I'm thinking about principle two. When students move into group work and individual work, I'm thinking about principle three and those ideas that I take from that. And if you prefer a table, it looks like this. So when I'm contextualizing the learning for my students, I'm contextualizing the essential knowledge from the content descriptors using principles 2 and 1 from the UDL framework. When I'm modeling individually and with the class, I'm modeling the essential skills from the content descriptor, and I'm using principles 2 and 1. When the students are working in groups and individually, they're demonstrating evidence of learning against the achievement standards. Remembering the achievement standards are what students are demonstrating evidence of learning against, not the content descriptors. Then when they're doing that, I'm thinking about principles 3 and 1 from the UDL framework. So let's have a look at how we embed our UDL strategies into our lesson planning process. So remember, in webinar 2, we identified our common characteristics, our strengths, our functional impact. And then in webinar 3, we looked at the UDL framework and identified strategies that tied to them. We're now going to put that into our lesson planning sequence. So we've got our contextualized essential knowledge, teacher modeling, and then with the class, the essential content descriptors, then group and independent work in relation to the achievement standard. So we're going to use that same process. I've just changed the colors to show how we would do this. So if I know that good teaching using the explicit instruction or direct instruction model is contextualization, teacher modeling, group work, and independent work, I go back to the strategies that I identified. I'm going to color code these to show them where you go. So the first step is I'm going to think about this contextualization of the knowledge. I'm going to go to my strategies that I identified and go, what would be useful? So when I'm contextualizing the knowledge, I reckon a visual schedule would be really useful. I reckon providing the PowerPoint to the students. I think using lots of visuals and concrete materials, e-readers, and these strategies highlighted blue would be useful. So I put them into that contextualization. So when I'm modeling independently and with the students, now I'm going back to the strategies I've identified that I know that would work. And I think about what would be essential to use here. So I know that when I'm modeling, I think if I filmed it and sent it to my students, rather than my students coming back to me all the time and asking how to do it, they could watch that video, and the e-readers would be useful. So I'd put those strategies into that part of that lesson sequence. So this probably wouldn't be one lesson. It might be a series of lessons. It might be a month. But notice these strategies here are the ones that we identified that were tied to our students' strengths and functional impacts. So based on what we know about our learners, they should work. So now when the students are working in groups, I go back to my strategies that I've identified. What would be really useful here? And let's have a look at those strategies. So there's a lot of strategies, I think, from what I identified that would really work during that group work phase. So I'll put that into the group work element. And when the kids are working independently, going back to the strategies, what do I think will work? So I've identified those orange and I'll put them into the explicit instruction. So during that contextualization of the essential knowledge, teacher modeling independently and with the class, I've thought about those essential strategies. During that group work and independent work, I've identified strategies I think will work. Notice they vary because I can't use the same strategy all the time at those 4 phases of the explicit instruction model because I'm doing different things. So I've showed a personalization of my teaching by discerning the important strategies. So if we come back to what we did in the first webinar, we identified, looking at the content descriptor, the essential knowledge and the essential skills. So the essential knowledge coming from the content descriptor of the year level and the essential skills. Then we looked at the achievement standard and we defined any cognitive verbs and any important terminology, and we worked out what the students need to demonstrate and not demonstrate. We then put that in here. So this is the essential knowledge. These are the essential skills that I'm modeling as a teacher independently and then with my students. And then looking at the achievement standards, what is it that students need to demonstrate as a group and independently? Then I go to my strategies and I identify what fits where. And this is what's that sequence of lessons over maybe a week, a month, our learning would look like. So this is an year 8 example that we did with students. So the teachers. So we contextualize what congruence versus similarity means, what transformations, plane shapes, and triangles are. During the teacher modeling, we did triangles and proved congruence. Then during group and independent work, students were naming if congruent or not, and named the properties of quadrilaterals, both as a group and independently. And these were the strategies based on the teacher students that we came up with as ideas around what that would look like during our teaching sequence. Here's another example from year 10. But essentially, the process comes back to this, identifying what is the essential knowledge in the content descriptors and the essential skills that we did when we were in webinar 1, then identify the essential achievement standards. We define any cognitive verbs and important terminology. We defined what students need to demonstrate and not demonstrate. Then we looked at the important strategies by knowing our students' characteristics, strengths, and functional impacts and mapping those to the UDL framework. And then we put them into our lesson sequence. So you have the sheet that's sent to you. So I asked you between webinars to deconstruct the content descriptor for the essential knowledge and skills, and then look at the achievement standards and define the glossary terms and cognitive verbs. So I'll get you to put those in here, then take the UDL aligned strategies and think about where they best fit and put them into this. So that's what we're going to do for the next 25 minutes. So it's 20 past now. So we'll come back at, say, 1:45 and finish off and have a look at some examples on my website that you can access that other colleagues around Queensland and Australia have developed. But for the next 25 minutes, I want you to go back to your sheet and I want you to take the essential knowledge and put it in here, essential skills, and then what essentially the achievement standards the students are demonstrating during group and independent work. Then look to your strategies that you've identified and put them into the relevant part of the explicit instructional gradual release model. So during the next 25 minutes, I'll be here. I'll turn my camera off and my mic, but if you want to ask a question, just shoot it into the chat and I'll jump back on. And we'll do that for 25 minutes and then we'll come back and we'll finish up. So 25 minutes, I'll put a timer on and we'll be back soon.